There are some mothers who would walk through fire for their children, and then there is my mother, the woman who looked me in the eyes, pressed 5 crumpled dollars into my hand, and told me she would be back soon before disappearing to another continent with her lover. She left my brother with our grandmother in a warm house with a full refrigerator, but me, she left alone in an empty home with nothing but silence and a promise she never intended to keep. I remember standing at the window watching her car pull away, and I remember the exact moment I stopped being a child. What my mother did not know, what she could never have imagined, was that her cruelty would become the foundation of everything I built. She thought she was throwing me away, but she was actually setting me free. For years she believed I was nothing, a forgotten daughter struggling to survive, barely worth a phone call on holidays. She had no idea that while she was busy favoring my brother and rewriting history to make herself the victim, I was quietly becoming someone she would never recognize. So when she finally came crawling back, desperate and broken, begging for help from the daughter she abandoned, she was not prepared for what she found. The moment she discovered the truth, her face went pale and her voice cracked as she whispered, "No, this cannot be real. Stay with me until the end, because what my mother learned that day changed everything. And trust me, you will not see the final twist coming." My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 42 years old, and I am a financial consultant who built her empire from nothing, a woman who learned that the people who are supposed to love you the most can sometimes be the ones who hurt you the deepest. Before I tell you what happened when my mother came back, I need to take you to the beginning, to the house where I learned that silence was survival, and that a daughter's worth could be measured against her brother's and found lacking every single time. The Carter family looked perfect from the outside. A hard-working father named Robert, a beautiful mother named Margaret, and 2 children who should have been equally loved, but never were. My father worked double shifts at the manufacturing plant, coming home with exhausted eyes and calloused hands, always making time to ask about my day, always telling me that education was my ticket to a better life. My mother, on the other hand, moved through our home like a woman trapped in a life she never wanted, sighing heavily when she cooked dinner, reminding us constantly of everything she had sacrificed, though I never quite understood what those sacrifices were. My younger brother Daniel was the golden child, the one whose homework my mother checked, the one whose sports games she attended, the one who received new clothes while I wore hand-me-downs from cousins I had never met. I learned early that asking for attention only led to disappointment, so I became invisible, a quiet girl who watched everything and said nothing. There are memories that seem meaningless when they happen, but grow heavier with time. I remember waking up late one night to use the bathroom and seeing my father hunched over the kitchen table, writing something by lamplight with a troubled expression that made him look older than he was. When he noticed me watching, he folded the paper quickly and said it was nothing, just some things he needed to sort out. I also remember my mother receiving phone calls that transformed her entirely, her voice dropping to a whisper, her cheeks flushing pink, her mood lifting in ways my father's presence never achieved. I was too young to understand what those calls meant, but somewhere deep inside I knew they were wrong. My father died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning, collapsing at work, after years of pushing his body beyond its limits to provide for a family that did not appreciate him. The doctor said his heart simply gave out, but I knew the truth was more complicated than that. The night before he died, he sat with me on the porch and told me something I would carry forever. He said I was stronger than I knew, and that no matter what happened, he believed in me. At his funeral, I watched my mother cry, but even then something felt wrong. Her tears seemed more like fear than grief, as if she was not mourning what she lost, but worrying about what would happen next. 2 years after my father's death, my mother sat me down and announced that she needed time for herself, time to heal, time to find who she really was. She arranged for Daniel to stay with our grandmother, where he would be warm and fed and loved. For me, she had a different plan. She pressed $5 into my palm, told me she would be back soon, and walked out the door with a suitcase and a man I vaguely recognized from those whispered phone calls. His name was Richard Hayes, and he was taking my mother to Europe while I stood alone in an empty house with no food in the refrigerator and no idea how I would survive. I later discovered that my mother had withdrawn every penny from my father's life insurance policy before she left money that was supposed to pay for both her children's futures and used it to fund Daniel's private school education, while I received nothing. I stood at the window watching her car disappear down the street, and I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I would never need her again, never ask her for anything, never give her the satisfaction of seeing me broken. What I did not know then, what I would not discover for another 6 years, was that my father had seen this coming, and he had prepared something that would change everything. The first week alone was the hardest thing I have ever endured. I rationed the $5 my mother left me buying bread and peanut butter from the corner store, making each meal stretch as long as possible. When the money ran out, I survived on whatever canned food remained in the pantry, eating cold beans straight from the tin because I was afraid to use the stove. I did not call the police or reach out to social services because I had heard stories about foster care about children separated from everything familiar and placed with strangers who did not want them. I told myself that if I could just hold on, if I could just survive long enough, things would get better. I was 12 years old, sleeping in an empty house, jumping at every sound, wondering if my mother would ever come back and knowing deep down that I did not want her to. On the 8th day, there was a knock at my door that changed everything. Helen Brooks was a neighbor who lived 3 houses down, a kind woman who had been friends with my father for years. She stood on my porch with grocery bags in her arms and concern in her eyes, and when I opened the door, she did not ask questions or make me explain. She simply walked inside, put the food in my refrigerator, and told me something that made me cry for the first time since my mother left. She said my father had asked her to look after me if anything ever happened to him, and that she never imagined it would be this soon. Helen became my lifeline during those dark months, bringing groceries, checking on me after school, making sure I had what I needed to survive without drawing attention from authorities who might take me away. She was not a replacement for family, but she was proof that someone in this world actually cared whether I lived or died. 6 months after she abandoned me, my mother returned as if nothing had happened. Richard Hayes had grown tired of her apparently, and she came crawling back to the life she had thrown away. I will never forget watching her explain her absence to relatives who asked uncomfortable questions. She told them she had been recovering from grief at a wellness retreat, that losing my father had been so traumatic, she needed time away to heal. She lied without blinking, without hesitation, without a single crack in her composure, and in that moment, I understood something fundamental about my mother. She was capable of rewriting reality to suit her needs, of believing her own lies so completely that they became her truth. When I confronted her privately about leaving me alone, she dismissed my suffering as a lesson in independence, told me I should be grateful for learning to stand on my own feet so young. There was no apology. No acknowledgement of what she had done, no recognition that she had nearly destroyed her own daughter. I learned then that expecting accountability from Margaret Carter was like expecting water to flow uphill. On my 18th birthday, Helen Brooks arrived at my door with a sealed envelope that had been waiting for me for 6 years. Inside was a letter from my father written in his familiar handwriting and documents for a small trust fund I never knew existed. His words brought me to my knees. He wrote that if I was reading this letter, he was already gone, and that he knew my mother might not be fair to me after his death. He had set aside money from his own parents' inheritance, not much, but enough for a start, and Helen would help me access it when I was old enough. The trust had been funded entirely with separate property that my mother had no legal claim to and never knew about because she had never bothered to care about my father's family. His final words to me were simple, but powerful. He told me to live my life and to stop waiting for recognition from people who did not deserve to give it. I cried over that letter for hours, grieving my father all over again, while simultaneously feeling his protection reaching across the years to save me. I used that trust fund as seed capital for my future. I studied finance in college, learned about real estate investment, and began building wealth so quietly that no one in my family suspected a thing. I maintained surface contact with my mother and brother, attending occasional holidays, sending brief messages on birthdays, but I shared nothing about my growing success. To them, I was still the forgettable daughter, working some forgettable job, barely surviving, not worth their attention. That was exactly how I wanted it. Then came the moment that tested my resolve. 5 years ago, Daniel appeared at my apartment begging for $30,000 to cover gambling debts. Against my better judgment, I gave him the money with 2 conditions: never tell our mother and never ask again. He agreed to both, looked me in the eyes, and promised. 2 weeks later, I heard through a cousin that Daniel had told our mother he made that money through smart investing, and Margaret had praised him for being so talented. I said nothing when I learned of his lie. I simply added it to the mental ledger I had been keeping since childhood, a record of every betrayal, every cruelty, every debt that would eventually come due. For 20 years, the Carter family believed I was barely surviving a forgettable daughter, working a forgettable job, not worth a second thought. They had no idea I was watching, waiting, and building something they could not imagine. Then one day, Daniel's number appeared on my phone, the first call in 3 years. His voice was shaking when he spoke. He said our mother was sick and that he was about to lose his house. I drove to the hospital the next morning, dressed in simple clothes that revealed nothing about who I had become. I chose a plain blouse, modest slacks, no jewelry, except the small watch my father gave me for my 16th birthday. I wanted my mother to see the daughter she remembered, the invisible girl who never amounted to anything, because the reveal would be so much sweeter when it came. The hospital room was small and sterile, filled with the beeping of machines and the sharp smell of antiseptic. My mother lay in the bed looking older than I expected, her face pale and her hair gray in ways I had never noticed before, but her eyes were the same, sharp and calculating, and when she saw me enter, she immediately began issuing commands as if 30 years of neglect had never happened. She told me I needed to help my brother because family takes care of family, and the irony of those words coming from her mouth was almost enough to make me laugh. Daniel stood in the corner looking like a man who had run out of options. His expensive clothes wrinkled his face unshaven, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He owed $200,000 on his mortgage and was facing foreclosure within weeks. The bank had already begun proceedings, and he had nowhere else to turn. My mother looked at me with expectation, waiting for the dutiful daughter to step forward and sacrifice herself once again. And I simply stood there in silence, letting the moment stretch until it became uncomfortable. The door opened behind me, and Thomas Reed walked in, carrying a leather briefcase that contained documents which would change everything. Thomas was my lawyer and business partner, a man I had worked with for over a decade, and his presence in that hospital room was not an accident. He introduced himself professionally, then turned to my brother with an expression that revealed nothing. He said he was there regarding Daniel's mortgage debt, that the bank had sold the defaulted loan to a new owner, and that he was representing that owner's interests. Daniel's face twisted with confusion as he demanded to know who had purchased his debt. What kind of vulture would buy a man's home out from under him? Thomas opened his briefcase, removed a stack of documents, and spoke 3 words that stopped time in that room. The new owner, he said, was Carter Investment, LLC. Daniel stared at the papers without comprehension, asking who owned Carter Investment, and Thomas turned to look at me before answering. He said the sole owner and founder of Carter Investment, LLC was Evelyn Carter, and the silence that followed was the most satisfying moment of my entire life. My mother's face drained of color so completely that I thought she might faint. Her voice came out as barely a whisper when she asked if I had a company, and I could see her entire understanding of reality crumbling around her. Thomas continued speaking because there was more truth to deliver, explaining that I was the owner of 3 apartment buildings and 2 commercial properties, that my investment portfolio was valued at a figure he started to name before I cut him off. I told him they did not need to know the numbers, and my mother stared at me as if seeing a stranger. She stammered, asking how this was possible, saying I was nothing. And those words hung in the air between us like a confession of everything she had ever believed about me. I looked at my mother lying in that hospital bed, the woman who had left me with $5, and walked away without looking back, and I felt a calm I had never experienced before. I told her that I was the daughter she left with $5, and that was not nothing, that was a starting point. The expression on her face shifted from confusion to something deeper, something that looked almost like fear, as she began to understand that the child she had discarded had grown into something she never anticipated. The door opened again, and Helen Brooks entered carrying an envelope that would deliver the final blow. Helen had aged gracefully in the years since my father's death, her hair now silver, but her eyes still sharp with the intelligence and kindness I remembered from childhood. She walked to my mother's bedside and handed her a copy of the letter my father had written, the letter that had been waiting for me on my 18th birthday. My mother took the papers with trembling hands, and Helen began to speak in a voice that carried the weight of decades of silence finally broken. She told my mother that Robert had known everything that he had known about Richard Hayes, known about the affair, known that Margaret would eventually leave. She said my father had known that Margaret would not protect me after he was gone, so he had done it himself, setting aside money and making arrangements to ensure his daughter would survive. My mother read the letter with shaking hands, and I watched as each word struck her like a physical blow. Her voice cracked when she spoke, asking if Robert had known she did not love him, and the vulnerability in that question was almost enough to make me feel something resembling pity. Helen answered without mercy, saying my father had worked himself to death not for money, but to ensure I would survive my own mother. The machines continued beeping in the silence that followed, and my mother's face crumpled as the full weight of her choices crashed down upon her. She whispered that this could not be real, repeating the words like a prayer that would not be answered, and I stood watching the woman who had abandoned me finally understand the consequences of her cruelty. Daniel's voice cut through the moment, desperate and panicked, asking if I was going to take his house. I turned to look at my brother, the golden child who had received everything while I received nothing, the man who had lied about the money I gave him and let our mother praise his non-existent talents. I told him I was not taking his house, that he would repay the debt through work for the first time in his life. His face contorted with disbelief as he looked to our mother for help, waiting for her to fix things the way she always had. But Margaret lay silent in her hospital bed with no power left to wield. For the first time in 40 years, she could not rescue her precious son, could not manipulate reality to give him what he wanted, could not sacrifice me to make his life easier. The shift in power was complete, and everyone in that room knew it. I gathered my things and moved toward the door, ready to leave this chapter behind me. My mother's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, the same wrist that had held 5 crumpled dollars 30 years ago, and her grip was surprisingly strong for a woman in a hospital bed. She asked if I would forgive her, and the desperation in her voice was something I had waited my entire life to hear. I looked down at her hand, wrapped around my wrist, remembering the child who had stood alone in an empty house, and I felt nothing but clarity. I pulled away gently and told her we would discuss forgiveness when she understood what she was actually asking forgiveness for, because saying sorry for leaving was not the same as understanding what that leaving had destroyed. I walked out of that hospital room without looking back, and for the first time in my life, I was the one with all the power. The months that followed my confrontation at the hospital brought changes I had anticipated, and others I had not expected at all. I returned to my life, to my work, to the peaceful existence I had built far from the chaos of the Carter family, and I watched from a distance as the consequences of decades of cruelty finally caught up with the people who had caused so much pain. I did not interfere, did not gloat, did not reach out to twist the knife. I simply let reality unfold as it always does when the lies stop working and the protections fall away. Daniel sold his house within 2 months, unable to make the payments, and unwilling to work hard enough to find another solution. The property went for less than he owed, and the remaining debt hung over him like a shadow he could not escape. His wife, a woman I had met only a handful of times at family gatherings, finally learned the truth about her husband's financial disasters, about the gambling that had consumed their savings, about the lies he had told to cover his failures. She filed for divorce before the house sale was even finalized, taking their children and moving to her parents' home in another state. For the first time in 40 years, Daniel Carter had to face life without someone rescuing him from his own choices. He took a job at a retail store, stocking shelves and answering to managers half his age, and the golden child who had received everything discovered what it felt like to earn a paycheck through actual labor. 6 months after the hospital confrontation, my phone rang with Daniel's number on the screen. I answered because I wanted to hear what he would say, whether time and hardship had taught him anything about accountability or gratitude. His voice was bitter when he spoke, complaining about his job, about his ex-wife, about how unfair everything had become. He asked me for money not with humility or acknowledgement of the past, but with the same entitled expectation he had carried his entire life. He said I owed him, that family was supposed to help each other, that I had more than enough to spare. I listened to every word, and when he finished, I told him no. I said I had given him $30,000 5 years ago, money he had lied about and used to make himself look successful while I remained invisible. I told him that was his one chance and he had wasted it. The line went silent for a moment before he cursed at me and hung up, and I felt nothing but confirmation that some people never change no matter how many opportunities they receive. My mother recovered from her illness, but found herself with nowhere to go when the hospital discharged her. Daniel could barely afford his own apartment, certainly not a space for his aging mother. The relatives who might have helped had heard too many stories over the years, had seen too much of Margaret's manipulation and selfishness, and none of them stepped forward to offer their homes. She entered a standard nursing facility on the outskirts of the city. Nothing fancy, nothing terrible, just a plain building where elderly people waited out their remaining years surrounded by strangers. I arranged for her bills to be paid through Thomas Reed anonymously because I did not want her to suffer in poverty, but I also did not want her to know the money came from me. I never visited, I never called. My absence was not cruelty, but simply the natural result of a relationship she had destroyed decades ago. I learned later what my mother's birthday was like in that nursing home, and the image has stayed with me ever since. She sat alone in her room, staring at her phone, waiting for calls that never came. Daniel was too consumed with his own problems to remember. Relatives had given up on maintaining contact. The silence around her was complete, and in that silence she had nothing to do but remember the past. I wonder if she thought about my 13th birthday, the first one after she returned from Europe, the one she forgot entirely because she was still distracted by the memory of Richard Hayes. I had waited all day for some acknowledgement, some small sign that my mother remembered I existed, but nothing came. She went to bed that night without saying a word about the occasion, and I learned that expecting anything from her was a mistake I would not make again. Now she sat in a nursing home experiencing the same forgottenness she had inflicted on me, and I felt no satisfaction in her suffering, only a quiet recognition that the universe sometimes delivers its own justice. The hardest moment of that year came when Helen Brooks passed away peacefully in her sleep. She had been declining for months, her body finally giving out after 72 years of a life well lived, and when Thomas called to tell me she was gone, I felt a grief I had not experienced since my father's death. Helen's funeral was small, attended only by me and a few old friends from her church people who remembered her kindness and her quiet strength. She had no children of her own, no family to carry on her legacy, but she had saved my life when I was 12 years old, and that meant more than any blood connection ever could. After the service, Helen's attorney gave me a small box she had left specifically for me. Inside were photographs of my father I had never seen before, pictures of him holding me as a baby, images of us together at parks and birthday parties, moments of pure joy captured on film and preserved across the decades. Beneath the photographs were notes in my father's handwriting, words he had written about his hopes for my future, his belief that I would grow into a woman who made him proud. At the bottom of the box was a single photograph that broke me completely. It showed my father and me sitting on our front porch, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling at the camera. On the back, in his familiar handwriting, were 3 words that I read through tears I could not stop. He had written my greatest pride, and for the first time in years I cried not from pain, but from the release of knowing I had become exactly who he believed I could be. My revenge was never loud or dramatic. I did not call my mother to mock her circumstances or visit Daniel to remind him of his failures. I simply lived my life fully and successfully, building my business, enjoying my freedom, surrounding myself with people who valued me for who I was. Every achievement was a reminder of what my family had discarded. Every peaceful morning was proof that their rejection had not destroyed me. I sent no updates about my success. I made no calls to share good news. My absence from their lives was complete, and that absence was the consequence they had earned through decades of cruelty and neglect. I placed my father's photograph on my mantel beside the picture of Helen I had kept for years. These were the people who had loved me, the family I had chosen, and the family that had chosen me back. I stood looking at their faces, feeling a peace I had not known was possible, when my phone buzzed with a message from the nursing home. The text said my mother was requesting a final meeting, that she had something important she wanted to tell me. I stared at those words for a long time, unsure whether I wanted to hear whatever she had to say. But somewhere beneath the walls I had built, there was a small voice suggesting that maybe, just maybe, there was one last thing that needed to be said before I could close this chapter forever. I waited 3 days before responding to the nursing home's message, not because I was unsure of my answer, but because I wanted to make the decision on my own terms, rather than reacting to my mother's request. I had spent too many years responding to her demands, jumping when she called, trying to earn approval that would never come. Those days were over, and if I chose to see her now, it would be because I decided it was right for me, not because she had summoned me. On the 4th day, I drove to the nursing facility with no expectations and no prepared speeches, only a calm certainty that whatever happened in that room would not change who I had become. The nursing home was quiet when I arrived, filled with the muted sounds of televisions playing behind closed doors and the soft shuffle of staff moving through hallways. My mother's room was at the end of a long corridor, and I walked toward it slowly, taking in the plain walls and fluorescent lighting so different from the comfortable home she had once commanded. When I opened her door, I found her sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at a small courtyard where a few trees struggled to bloom in the late autumn cold. She looked older than I had ever seen her, smaller somehow, as if the commanding presence that had once filled every room she entered had finally shrunk to match her actual size. She turned when she heard me enter, and something flickered across her face that might have been relief or might have been fear. She spoke first, her voice softer than I remembered saying, simply that I came. I remained standing near the door, keeping distance between us, and told her she had said there was something she wanted to tell me. The silence stretched between us as she gathered her thoughts, and I watched her face cycle through emotions I had rarely seen her display. When she finally spoke again, her words came slowly, as if each one cost her something to release. She told me she knew Robert had been unhappy, that she had known for years before he died, that their marriage was hollow, and that he deserved better than what she gave him. She said she knew she was hurting me even back then, favoring Daniel, because it was easier ignoring my needs, because I never demanded attention the way my brother did. She told me she had convinced herself I was strong enough to handle whatever she did, that my silence and self-sufficiency meant I did not need the same care and love she gave so freely to my brother. But now, after all these months alone with nothing but time to think, she understood that was just her excuse, a story she told herself so she could keep choosing her own desires over everyone else. The truth, she said, was that she had chosen herself every single time, chosen herself over me, over my father, over anyone who might have needed something from her. She paused and looked at me with eyes that held no expectation, no demand, no manipulation. She said she was not asking me to forgive her because she knew that was too much to ask. She just needed me to know that she understood what she had done, that she was not pretending anymore, that the excuses were gone. I stood in silence for a long moment, processing words I had never expected to hear from her mouth. My mother had never admitted fault for anything in her entire life, had always found ways to twist reality until she emerged as the victim or the hero. Hearing her speak with such raw honesty was disorienting, like watching a statue suddenly come to life and reveal itself as something entirely different than what I had believed. I moved to the chair across from her and sat down, not out of warmth, but because my legs suddenly felt unsteady beneath me. I told her I was not going to say I forgave her, that the word felt wrong for what had happened between us. Forgiveness implied some kind of restoration, some path back to what we should have been, and that path did not exist. But I told her I had let it go not for her sake but for mine, because carrying the weight of her failures had become exhausting, and I had finally decided to put it down. I explained that letting go was different from forgiveness, and I would not pretend otherwise or wrap our conversation in comfortable language that made everything seem resolved. She nodded slowly as tears began falling down her cheeks, and she said what I was offering was more than she deserved. I looked at the woman who had shaped so much of my pain and simply agreed with her. Yes, I said it was more than she deserved. I stood to leave, and she did not try to stop me this time, did not grab my wrist or beg for promises I could not keep. I paused at the door because there was one more thing that needed to be said, not for her comfort but for clarity between us. I told her I would make sure she was taken care of, that she would not suffer in poverty or neglect, because despite everything, I was not the kind of person who abandoned people to cruelty. But I also told her I would not be here often, maybe holidays, maybe not, and she should not wait by the phone, expecting calls that might never come. This was not punishment. I explained just the truth of what we had become, the natural result of bridges she had burned decades ago. She nodded again, and I saw in her eyes the understanding that some things once broken can only be acknowledged and never repaired. I walked out of her room and down the long corridor, and I did not look back. The drive home felt different than any journey I had taken before, lighter somehow, as if invisible chains I had not even known I was carrying had finally fallen away. I pulled into my driveway and looked at the house I had built for myself, the home filled with things I had chosen and memories I had created on my own terms. Inside, the photographs on my mantel caught the afternoon light, my father's face smiling out at me from one frame, Helen's kind eyes watching from another. These were the people who had truly loved me, the family I had chosen when the family I was born into proved unworthy of the title. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, returning to the work that had given me purpose and independence, and I found myself smiling without even realizing it. The expression on my face was not the smile of victory over defeated enemies or satisfaction at revenge finally achieved. It was something quieter than that. Something deeper, the smile of a woman who had finally found peace after decades of struggle. I looked around my home at the life I had built, successful and quiet and entirely my own, and I understood something I wished I had known 30 years ago, standing alone in that empty house. The greatest revenge is not making the people who hurt you suffer. It is not watching them lose everything or forcing them to acknowledge their cruelty. The greatest revenge is building a life so complete, so peaceful, so entirely your own that they can no longer touch it with their chaos or diminish it with their judgment. I did not need my mother's approval anymore. Looking back honestly, I never really had, even when I thought I did. And in the end, I discovered I did not need her punishment either, did not need to see her broken or humiliated to feel whole. I just needed to be free from the weight of her choices, free from the hope that she might change, free from the exhausting work of caring about someone who had never truly cared about me. I just needed to be free. And sitting in my home, surrounded by the evidence of everything I had overcome, I finally was. This story began with a mother who left her daughter with $5 and a broken heart, believing that child would never amount to anything worth remembering. It ended with that same daughter standing tall, successful beyond imagination, free from the chains of a family that never deserved her loyalty. Evelyn Carter did not find her happy ending through revenge or cruelty. She found it by building a life so complete that the people who abandoned her could no longer diminish it with their presence or their absence. She learned that letting go is not the same as forgiveness, that walking away is not the same as weakness, and that the greatest victory is simply becoming someone you are proud to be. If this story touched your heart, if you saw pieces of yourself in Evelyn's journey, or if you know someone who needs to hear that their worth is not defined by the people who failed to see it, please share this video with them. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of strength, survival, and the quiet power of choosing yourself. Drop a comment below, telling me what moment hit you the hardest, whether it was the hospital confrontation, the letter from her father, or that final conversation in the nursing home. I read every single comment, and your words help me know which stories resonate most deeply with all of you. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for being part of this community, and remember, you are stronger than you know, just like Evelyn's father told her all those years ago. Until next time, take care of yourselves.